So I want to look back real briefly at the 2010 legislative session. Well, first of all, actually, we kind of run low on the lead the way reports that are being passed out. So if you did not get one, give me a business card or shoot me an email, or one of us on staff, and we'll be sure to send you one in the mail. We can send you several if you need more than one copy. I think a few folks in the room probably already have one, but I want to make sure that everybody who wants one gets one. So sorry for being a little short-handed today. So during the 2010 session, things are kind of largely the same as the last couple of years, where kind of some of the buzzwords going around, we're talking about economic stimulus and jobs. It didn't matter who you were talking to, whether the governor on down, was talking about how do we create more private sector jobs in Washington State. And the data shows that the jobs come from small businesses, particularly during recessionary periods. While the big boys are still laying off, the small and medium-sized businesses are the ones expanding. Now, this recession is a little bit different than the last several we've faced. And the fact that it started primarily in the credit markets and the credit freeze, which meant that small businesses did not have access to capital that they need to expand. So there's really only so much the state of Washington can do on that side of things. So they had to look for more creative solutions to try to incent small businesses to expand. And so what they do? Well, they raise taxes on small businesses. So I might have an issue with some of the things that they did, but I want to walk through a couple of things real briefly and kind of just draw your attention to them. Although you probably pretty much are aware of a lot of the stuff that happened this last legislative session. I'm not sure if Jason mentioned it at the forefront of his talk. I missed the first part. But, so the legislature decided to raise the B&O tax on the service industry 20%, from 1.5% to 1.8%. 1.5% was already the highest B&O tax rate classification in the state, and so they jacked it up 20%. It's going to raise, I think, about $240 million over the next 14 months or so. That's no small chunk of change. And frankly, and this is going to hit small businesses and large businesses. But it's gonna be tough to basically handle a lot of this stuff if you're a small business. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to small business owners who have said, we're just barely hanging on as is. And it's interesting because that conversation really took place a little over a year ago with a lot of them. The summer of 2009, we had been going through this economic recession for about a good year now, and folks were just saying, oh boy, just hang on, hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel, but as of last summer there was not. And so, kind of leading up to the legislative session, there was some hope in the sense that maybe some things would change in certain areas. And so a couple of areas that were of great concern to small businesses were payroll taxes. So leading up to the 2010 legislative session, Department of Labor and Industries came out and said, well, we have to raise your workers' compensation premiums by 7.6%, which is the average. And that's no small chunk of change that small business owners, or every business owner, had to incorporate into their business plan, their business model looking forward, which is very difficult to do when you're in a contractionary period, a recessionary period, as opposed to one of expansion. It's always easier to add cost to your bottom line when more money is flowing in than than the previous year, but that wasn't the case for a large amount of folks out there. So it was a very difficult time. This was I think it was September, September when they announced it. So, and realistically, and we can talk about workers' comp more in a minute, the rate increase should have actually been closer to 20% to keep the funds solvent. The state auditor came out with a report in December that said that one of the main funds in the workers' compensation system faced about a 75% chance of going insolvent within the next 3 years. That's huge from an actuarial standpoint. You do not want to be in that position. Right now, workers' comp, our workers' comp system has a pretty sizable trust fund to basically act as a buffer during recessionary periods. It's one of the reasons why our workers' comp fund actually has acted somewhat better than on average some of the other state systems that took a huge hit in the market, although ours took a massive hit in the market as well. So you had 7.6% payroll tax addition coming on to small businesses for 2010, and about 3 weeks later, unemployment insurance, Employment Security Department came out and said, well, your UI taxes are going to go up on average 54%. And I have yet to meet somebody, a small business owner, who said my UI taxes only went up 54%. Frankly, I would love it if they only went up 54%. I think pretty much everyone I've talked to, they've gone up to 100%. I've heard stories of 800% and even 1,200%. So this is huge. And just 2 weeks ago, ESD department said to expect at least a 40% rate increase again this year, and another rate increase again in 2012, and that the rates wouldn't start coming back down at best case scenarios until 2013.
What's driving that?
What's driving it?
Yeah.
There's a whole list of it. I mean the main driver is that they never expected unemployment rate to hover around between, it's at 8.9 right now, which is good comparatively speaking, but it was up to 9.5, 9.6% for months. It drew the trust fund down very, very quickly, and we also added benefits last year, and we've been increasing the weekly benefit, we've been increasing the eligibility requirements for being eligible for UI. It's up to 11 reasons now as how you can qualify for UI. It's called voluntary quits. And there's a whole host of data on the impacts of that. So you had workers' compensation going up 7.6% on average, UI going up 54% on average, and small businesses saying, what in the world is going on, leading into the 2010 legislative session where you had several taxes raised, both on B&O. And let's face it, I mean, a lot of, I've talked to a few convenience store folks who are dealing now with the candy and bottled water taxes, and even though that they can pass on a lot of these taxes to the customers, which are you and me, it takes compliance cost money. I mean, to comply with new taxes, even if they're passing it on. Same with the B&O service tax. You still pass it on, but you still incur costs just simply complying with it. I think the great example, obviously, which you're probably familiar with, is the candy example of 3,000 different candies. Somebody at DOR had to sit down and go line by line over which candy was supposed to be taxed and which is not. Imagine if you were a small business owner, a convenience store clerk, who had to do the same thing, essentially, basically taking, Department of Revenue might give you an Excel spreadsheet or something that you can plug into your QuickBooks if you're lucky. But we saw this a couple of years ago with the streamlined sales tax, which is, I don't want to get into that discussion except to say it was very complicated. Even if it didn't add costs, like immediate costs to the small business owner in the sense of writing the check now to the state, to comply with it takes time and resources, and small businesses don't have the same sort of resources that larger businesses do. Small businesses really need to be focused on running their business and becoming more efficient, serving their customers, and less time, in our opinion, as little time as feasible, dealing with regulations and paying taxes. Obviously, we need to comply with regulations, we need to pay taxes, we need to do our fair share, but we should make sure that they spend the majority of their time being productive, and that's how we get out of this recessionary period, is through expansion and private sector economic growth. So, leading into discussion of looking forward, what's coming up in the rest of 2010 and early 2011, as Paul mentioned, the Workers' Compensation Initiative I-1082 is a result of the legislature failing to act in any way, shape, or form on workers' comp, even though it was promised that there would be several reforms seriously taken a look at during the 2010 legislative session. In fact, there was a good bipartisan bill dropped by Jeff Morris up in Anacortes, some of his districts. Anyway, but it had bipartisan support, kind of more incremental changes on cost containment measures. And I won't go into details here. Essentially, it's safe to say that the business community was on board. Labor was kind of vacillating, but they weren't blowing steam out their ears quite that bad. I think they could have lived with it. But regardless, it didn't even get a hearing. There was no action taken whatsoever on workers' compensation reform during the session, even though leading up to it, everybody from the Speaker of the House down to the chairman of both the House and Senate Commerce and Labor Committee said we will seriously take a look at what we can do for the business community in workers' comp reform. A lot of it had to do with the Boeing decision last October, you may remember, where Boeing came out and said, we're going to put our second 787 production line in South Carolina for a variety of reasons. I don't think a lot of folks got that message. That's, the response to the Boeing move was, well, we don't want to be South Carolina. And I think, those of us in the business community said, well, maybe not, but they just got our business. What is more important here? Do we put a step forward and become competitive? Because we face competition from other states, we face competition from China, India right now, and it's only going to get worse. We're going to sit on our high horse and say, well, I don't want to be Alabama, I don't want to be Tennessee, because they're from the South and we don't want to be them. Well, that's fine, but they're going to take our money if we don't act accordingly. I mean, it's simple economics. If you're a business, if you're Boeing, and let's face it, I mean, Boeing moved its headquarters a decade ago. So really, they're a Chicago-based business. Apparently somebody didn't think about the fact that Chicago doesn't really think about Seattle the way that they used to 10, 20, 50 years ago. And they're going to make a business decision. They're going to make the best decision that's in the interest of their business. And this entitlement mentality really did us in, I think, with this Boeing decision. So, and that was just kind of the canary in the coal mine. I wish more folks had paid attention to this. They did not. So you ended up with the 2010 session with higher taxes on business, no workers' comp reform whatsoever. A funny little aside was there was even a piece of legislation to create a task force to look at how it would best to reform the workers' comp system. It didn't even get a hearing. And so you know that you are butting your head against a brick wall when they're not even doing studies to study a problem. I mean, this is the legislature loves to create task forces and studies, and they wouldn't even go that far as far as workers' comp reform. So BIAW and a few other folks on the business community said, fine, we're dropping the nuclear bomb, we're filing 1082, which we will open up the industrial insurance system to private sector competition. What it does not do is completely privatize the state fund. The state fund will still remain the state fund. As President Obama said, if you like what you have, you can keep it. But you will now have competition on the private sector side. This was most recently done in West Virginia earlier this decade. The legislation passed in 2005. They began the transition period in 2006. The transition period wrapped up in 2008. So we've had about a year and a half now, about 2 years now, of data, or at least empirical, evidence of what's going on. So as soon as West Virginia, which West Virginia used to be just like Washington State, a monopolistic system. As soon as they did this, they have now 198 industrial insurance companies who provide industrial insurance coverage. Their premiums dropped on average 30%. Customer service went up. Basically all the metrics that you basically monitor how a system does in an industrial or an insurance system went through the roof in a positive manner. And again, what's the rejoinder from folks who are against 1082 for the most part? Well, we don't want to be West Virginia.
Aren't there 20 states that have this same system where it's they have the state system and they have the public option, the private option?
It's like 20 or 22, something along those lines. You're right. It is, and the rest of them. So you have three. You have 4 states: Washington, Montana, Ohio, Wyoming, I think, who are state monopolistic.
Right.
So the state controls everything. Then you have 19, 20, 21 states with the hybrid system, where you have a state fund and also private sector, and then the rest of the states are private sector only.
Right.
There have been other states. Oklahoma recently took a look at this. Arizona just did this, where they took the state fund, which was previously competing with the private sector, and said, we can't do it anymore. We're going to turn into a mutual insurance company and privatize the state fund. So not only are states opening up their systems to private sector industrial insurance competition, they're starting to realize that they shouldn't be in the business of running it in the first place, and they're starting to even get rid of the state fund and turn it over into a mutual insurance company. Yeah, right here first.
Any size business, can anyone get into this if 1082 goes?
Yes.
Can any size business?
Yes. One of the benefits, I think, of 1082 is that you would now be able to do a group self-insure. So, backtracking just a little bit, if you are a very large business in the state of Washington, you can self-insure, but that's the Boeings, the Microsoft. You have to basically pass a very rigorous test. You have to have a lot of money, cash on hand, and you still have to meet, like I said, the state requirements to be able to self-insure. The Director of Department of Labor and Industries have to sign off on you self-insuring. So now if you are a small business, you can group with other small businesses in a similar industry as yours. So you can't have construction workers with accountants, say, but you can have accountants, you can have construction workers, you can have janitors, you can have groups that self-insure. And what the aim of, and most other states have this, by the way. The aim, again, is to try to make sure you are insured amongst your industry peers, try to bring down costs so you don't have outliers like I say, you know, you're now grouped with somebody else who has, you know, disproportionately high costs. Yeah.
And just quickly on 1082, it also eliminates the employee's contribution.
Yep.
All right, how do you feel, how does that play in?
You know, I like it in the sense that, you know, if everything else being equal, it could increase costs of businesses, but we're betting and looking at the research and data that other states have done, the business's costs will go down far enough that incurring the extra expense of picking up the whole entire premium tab, they'll still see savings overall. And so that's why, and plus, you know, I think it's good. In this, we're the only state that allows or says that employers can pass on a part of this cost to employees. In Washington, nowhere else in the nation do employees kick in for their industrial insurance premiums. Yeah.
How does the privatizing then address, because in most states that are privatized, their claim time, I believe our state's about 270 days on average.
Time loss, yes.
Time loss, and then it goes down to about 90 days, I think.
Yeah.
So what kind of a savings do you think that would be? Because I know with open claims, that's a huge issue in certain companies where 3 or 4 years they have open claims and the rates just keep going up.
Yeah.
So how would that?
Yeah, there's also another mechanism that will help keep that down, which is the lump sum settlements.
Right. Right.
And so, you know, I actually haven't seen that data. I just haven't come across it, but I'll look for it. I don't have that number off the top of my head.
King 5 just did a piece, if anyone saw it, about a week and a half ago on a company in Oak Harbor. They had a 4-year open claim, and the rates were just kept going up and up. And there was fraud there, obviously, if they had to follow the guy. But that's one of the results I've seen, is that there's a huge reduction in the time that.
Yeah, and from a business standpoint, you know, obviously no one wants to act in an inhumane way and put an employee back to work when they're not physically able to do so. That's not the point. The point is to make sure that, like you say, the fraud and the waste gets cut. You make the system more efficient. You get an employee back to work when they can. And chances are, if you use some of these medical provider networks that other states can use that we cannot, you will have better care, get somebody back to work. That helps the business bottom line, helps the employee get back to work, and puts less strain on the insurance system as a whole. Yeah.
How long were the study, over what period of time? How many years?
Which?
The studies in the other states.
So West Virginia just did it a couple years ago. Nevada did it 11 years ago.
But the study itself, was it taken from the get-go of privatizing to last year?
Oh, I'm sorry.
The length of the.
Which study?
Well, you mentioned in other states, so you can give.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different studies I'm referring to here in my talk. So, like I said, West Virginia, I've seen studies going back to 2005, and then Oregon puts out a very interesting workers' comp study every other year. I mean, so that goes back a decade. So we're pretty much taking a look over since 1990 up until 2010 is kind of what we're focusing on as far as how Washington State stacks up to other states.
I worked for Starbucks Corporation for 10 years in contracting, and outsourcing can be a mess in a long-term period. If you're looking short-term, yeah, the gains seem to be much larger than they are over time. So that's why I was asking.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Would you mind explaining a little bit more your proposal for the B&O tax?
Sure. All right, so tax reform. Tax reform is always a fun topic, and I'm making sure there's no tomatoes on here that's going to be thrown at me. You know, it's interesting. The business and occupation tax has been around since the 1930s. It was put in temporarily as a response to the Great Depression. 80 years later, we still have it. It's often referred to throughout the nation as probably the worst tax on business that you can absolutely have. Because it taxes first dollar in, regardless of your profitability. And if you take a look at the statistics, and the Kauffman Foundation out of Kansas City is fantastic with this information. Businesses that make money, or excuse me, businesses that don't make money are generally speaking new or small or both. So when you go through a recessionary period, like I mentioned up front, you want to have the small businesses and medium-sized businesses, regardless if they're new or been around for 5 or 10 years. You want them to be able to expand. That's where private sector job growth comes from. So when you're hitting them disproportionately hard, it makes it just that much more difficult to expand. So that in mind, you know, the conversation on tax reform, generally speaking, always goes like this. I hate B&O tax. What next? Income tax, right? Well, you know, for various reasons, we don't necessarily trust the income tax, whether it's personal or corporate either. You know, there can be a case to be made, I think, about an income tax that could work as long as you write it into the Constitution. But that's never part of the conversation. It's always statutorily written in, and then it could be amended. And a perfect case of this was a couple of years ago when the high earners income tax was first floated by Senator Lisa Brown. It started out at $500,000 a person, and by the end of the day, it had gone down to $100,000 per person. Not as a proposal, but just as an idea that was floating around the Senate chamber. And which is a perfect example of why you have to write stuff like this into the Constitution. Otherwise, it's just, you're going to be, you know, like Paul always says, the federal income tax started 1% on the top 1%. Now, most of us are paying it. So you have to be very careful about it. So the business community has, through 80 years, has been able to successfully carve out a lot of tax exemptions and credits, deductions for themselves. And some of them are fine. Some might be a little more dubious. Some might not be doing anything at all. Which is why you have these tax preference committees and studies being put out. You know, are these tax breaks actually doing anything? So, but we have is a system that really becomes complicated. There are, I think, about 300 or so exemptions, credits, or deductions amongst all industries, small and large, written in the B&O tax. So it becomes complicated if you're a small business owner, particularly to comply with this stuff. So the governor at AWB Day, I think it was in 2009, stood up before the audience, and I was in the audience, and so was Jason, said, I hear a lot that you guys don't like the B&O tax, come up with a third, and you don't like income tax, come up with a third way, third option. So Jason and I sat down a little over a year ago and said, okay, well, let's take her up on this. We met with their staff and a few other folks, and they said, good luck. And so, you know, I mean, the unfortunate thing is there's no silver bullet, particularly with the B&O tax. One of the bad things, well, there's several bad things, but, you know, first off, I think is lack of transparency. You don't know how much of the good or service you're paying for goes towards paying the B&O tax. It's not like a sales tax where it shows up on the receipt. The other thing is that it pyramids. So almost kind of like a VAT tax in the sense where, you know, the cost, let's say if you take and we use in the policy brief an example of a 2x4 that starts off inside of a tree up on a mountain, and every time it basically moves through the production line, it gets, the B&O tax gets added on. When you go to Home Depot to buy that 2x4, you don't know how much of that you're paying for in B&O tax. Right. So we wanted to try to get at some of the main concerns with the B&O tax, which is it hammers folks on their because you can be unprofitable and still have to pay. Right. And so other states that have gross receipts taxes allow you to write off the cost of production or the cost of labor. In Texas, they also allow you to take a kind of a standard deduction and just say, you know, I think in Texas it's 40%, and just basically take that off the top of your business operations, and you're taxed on the rest. We did some economic modeling on several different scenarios, increasing the sales tax, putting in an income tax, flat rate B&O tax, and this Texas franchise tax. And the Texas franchise tax, or the margins tax, was modeled the best. And so we decided to kind of go with that. It didn't model fantastically better than the other ones, but it was up here where the income tax was actually down here. What's that? Oh, sorry. The income tax was down here, margin tax was up here, sales tax and flat in the B&O were kind of in the middle. So we sat down and tried to flesh it out. We worked with the Tax Foundation, we worked with some other economists. It's not a perfect solution, but what we're trying to do is two things. One, basically acknowledge the fact that there are other options out there besides income tax and income tax and income tax. And really trying to massage the B&O tax into a way that we think would be better for particularly the small and new businesses. So being able to write off the cost of production, being able to write off the cost of labor, or taking 60% of your gross and basically writing that off and being taxed on the margin. And the other thing we would do is remove, and this is very important, we would remove the taxing administration from the cities and jurisdictions that currently also impose a B&O tax. So there are 38 cities that impose a city B&O tax. The cities would still see revenue, but you would only have to pay one B&O or one tax which would just go to the state would redistribute that money to the cities. It would also, we're trying to also simplify the system and the administration of the tax. So, you know, it also gets rid of a lot of the current exemptions and deductions that are written into law. So there are actually a lot of business groups that are not comfortable with this proposal as of yet, simply because they are the ones who have exemptions or deductions written into current law. But what we're trying to do is lower the rate, broaden the base, so that everybody pays, but pays less than that they probably would now. So that's kind of the overarching what we're trying to do.
Do you generate as many dollars?
Yes, we want to make sure that revenue staying revenue neutral was very important. We want to make sure that this wasn't a colossal tax grab or revenue enhancements or anything like that. We wanted to say, okay, if we're going to deal with existing dollars, existing revenue, how do we make the system more efficient? Yeah.
So does your proposal deal with, because you identified obviously the most regressive part of it, which is that it's not on profit, but it's on sales, so regardless if you make a profit. So like Idaho, they have a higher rate, but they do it on the profit, and then in Florida, I believe, they actually allow businesses that invest in the community with dollars to have an exemption that way. So they use the tax as an incentive to say if the business community helps us with certain aspects of services in the community that the government would have to pay for, we're going to give you a credit. Since we don't have an income tax, so that we can give that kind of a credit, almost in a way like a charitable deduction would work. So does your proposal address the aspect of still the net profit, or is it still on the?
Well, we can't hit the net profit, otherwise that would be an income tax, and we would have to change the Constitution. So
okay.
What we're trying to do is margins. Which margins are dynamic. They fluctuate. So we're trying to get as close as you can in law without making it a strict income tax, because then it's an income tax. So being able to write off the cost of labor or production or 60% gets you close.
You can almost zero out if a business is not profitable. You're saying you could almost zero out.
But there will be outliers where unprofitable businesses may still have to pay the tax. Yes, that is possible.
Why don't you take two more questions right here and right there, and then, because we're going to end on time, and then we also have a short 1 or 2 minute presentation about a website resource that we have, and we'll wrap up with that.
Honestly, I just don't know how much revenue is generated by the B&O tax. So what are we looking at? If it's so detrimental to businesses, wouldn't it just be nice if we just got rid of it? But how much revenue is it?
I think it's about $2.9 billion per year. It's substantial. It's after sales and property tax, or I know sales is first. I'm not sure actually off the top of my head if B&O is second or third. But it's big, so you can't. Unfortunately, you just can't get rid of it. No. Last question, yes.
As I've thought about the tax issue, of course, I believe we have to do the restructure the spending, so we need to know what to finance. But we seem to have this patchwork tax system in this state that really could use reform A to Z. Yeah. Is that too utopian a thought to have? Is that just so Mary Poppins and unrealistic that I should wash it from my mind?
You should be in charge of them.
Or is that really something that we should strive for as a goal?
Well, look, if you thought any of these ideas are too utopian, you wouldn't be in this room running. So you always have to have a goal in mind of, in a perfect world, this is what we would like to see, and here are steps to try to, even incremental steps to get there. And you may never get there, but if you make the system better and more efficient overall, you've done some good. So, in that sense, yes, this is why I think groups like the Policy Center are so useful, because we don't have to worry about re-election or coming off like that. We can come up.
You can do the Mary Poppins.
Yeah, we can kind of fill that role, and then it's up to the legislature and elected officials to try to figure out how to implement it, because that's when you get into dealing with special interests and other groups. And what comes out on the other end isn't always what you started with, but if it's better than the current system, then you've done some good. So, you don't want to be too head in the clouds all the time, but you want to have, kind of a mindset of where you're going. All right, thanks guys.
Okay.